Today, we will be discussing protecting and recovering human trafficking victims in Texas. As you probably all saw in the introduction slides, this is a webinar presented by the Coordinating Council. The Coordinating Council was created in 2019, and it's a group of some of the top state agencies working together to coordinate and lead human trafficking across the state. Before we get started, we have a couple of poll questions, just kind of to get some demographic questions to know who is attending this webinar. So please feel free to fill out these poll questions before we get started. The Coordinating Council's work is comprehensive across all aspects of trafficking, from prevention to victim identification, investigation, prosecution, rehabilitation, and beyond. We have broken the strategic plan into 5 parts: prevent, protect, prosecute, provide support, and partner. As we noted, today we will be talking about protect. All right. My name is Emily Landon, and we are very excited to present this webinar series for you. This historic strategic plan is the first of its kind to chart an end to human trafficking in Texas. As you will note, these webinars will occur for the next few weeks, every Tuesday at 12 p.m. At each webinar, we will have a group of select subject matter experts, coordinating council leaders, human trafficking survivors to speak on each section. Today, we have some excellent speakers, including from the Department of Public Safety, Chief Floyd Goodwin and Captain Eric Wilson. From the Texas Alcoholic and Beverage Commission, Chief Ron Swinson. From the Texas Park and Wildlife Department, we have Assistant Commander James Lindsay. From the Human Trafficking Survivor Leaders Council, we have Sophia Struther. And from the Texas Office of the Attorney General, we have Kara Pierce. All right, as we talk about our strategic plan today, there are 5 recommendations highlighted in the strategic plan in order to protect and recover our human trafficking victims. Strategy 1 is multidisciplinary collaboration. Strategy number 2, consistency across the state with customized services for victims. Strategy 3, victim-centered interdiction. Strategy 4, enhancing internal and external knowledge. And strategy 5, safeguarding victims' rights and access to crucial resources. And we will go through all of these strategies today from some of the experts in the field to tell you a little bit more about what we mean behind these strategies. So now we will begin with Ron Swinson from TABC.
Good afternoon, Emily, and thank you for having me. I really appreciate it. Is everybody able to hear me?
We can hear you.
Good deal. So this slide represents something that is near and dear to my heart, and I think all law enforcement agencies. When we conduct investigations, it's important that we follow a flow to ensure that we dot all the I's and cross all the T's. And when we, as the coordinating council, as we talked about it, we thought about it in steps. And today, of course, is the protect step, but it's important that everybody understands how the steps work together. So I'm going to go through all the steps and kind of give a little case study on a case that we worked down in the McAllen area with the DA's office. We collaborated with DPS, FBI, and it's concluded, but not fully adjudicated. So I'm not going to be able to give all of the details, but I'll start with step 1, assessing the threat. You know, the most actionable intelligence through open source web pages is what I think you got to do. You have to be proactive, not just open source, but closed source. If you have a criminal intelligence unit, if you have analysts that can dig up the data. One thing that we've done at TABC is using risk-based enforcement. So we'll look at permits. Now, not every human trafficking incident occurs in a bar or a restaurant, but there's a decent majority of them that do. So we've taken kind of an algorithm approach and looked at the probability that violations might occur based on past history. Are they conducting other violations? Do we have minors in there? Are they doing drink solicitation? Do they have a past history of allowing prostitution in there? and then also the length of the permit. So doing that risk-based enforcement and knowing your target is very important. Gathering actionable intelligence through analytical resources and data mining. Again, you can find a ton of data if you just know where to look. So that's very, very important. The case that I'm talking about, Rita's, one of the things that we did with assessing the threat was we worked with various non-governmental organizations, Refugee Services of Texas in particular, and they reached out to us and gave us information on a location, and we were able to look at some of those data points and identify the location where these girls had been trafficked out of, which gave us, so we could focus our efforts very specifically. Step two, the protect part, investigate and conduct operations. You know, this is the meat and potatoes of law enforcement. This is what we do. This is where probably most of the work comes in, at least from law enforcement perspective. And that's why law enforcement has taken the lead on the protect step. But sharing resources, intelligence, and funding. I'll say this, any human trafficking case is too big for any one agency. You have to coordinate with your NGOs, with your district attorneys or your AUSAs, and sharing that intelligence. We can't be in a silo when we're conducting these investigations, and we have to work together. Conducting the investigations into the allegations, how are you going to conduct that? Are you going to do undercover operations? Are you going to do surveillance? Are you going to send in a confidential human source? How are you going to do that? This particular case with Rita's down in McAllen, we did a little bit of everything, but most importantly, we used undercover officers in there, where we were able to find other violations. She was the permittee was selling narcotics, prostitution. She actually wanted our undercover agents to smuggle undocumented immigrants for her. So we had built a really good case on her, and victims, rescue victims and arrest criminals. So we had enough to arrest her, but we still wanted to build this case and make sure that we had all of our I's dotted and all of our T's crossed. Moving on to the prosecute side of it, what we did was we met with the prosecutor, the border prosecutor, Kelly McCormick was his name, out of the Hidalgo County District Attorney's Office. And we basically laid out the case. And in working with him, what was great was he actually caught something that we didn't. We had a statute of limitations issue. A lot of the trafficking that we were alleging had occurred more than 10 years ago. So we had to think outside the box really quick, and we ended up getting her indicted for multiple sexual abuse of child rather than human trafficking. There was one that fell within, and then her son was a Texas syndicate member, and we were able to get him indicted also on some aggravated sexual abuse of children. And that was a great opportunity for us to work with the DA's office. We worked hand in hand with DPS. We had HSI working with us to facilitate some of the immigration issues. The NGOs, Rio Grande Legal Services was fantastic. They were able to help with the victims getting services. And of course, Refugee Services of Texas was fantastic. Asset forfeiture, one thing I really like to hit on when we're doing these cases is we don't want to just throw them in jail and, in our case, shut down the permit, but we also want to take away anything that they had gained illegally through that. We currently are using asset forfeiture chapter 59 to seize her house and two houses. One is her house, one is a house that she held the women against their will at, and the bar where she actually was pimping the girls out of. So using all the tools in your toolbox, you got to hit them with those administrative sanctions, cancel the permit, asset forfeiture if you can, and which state is best, state or federal. I will say right now they've identified more victims, and the feds are looking at possibly picking up that case. So this might turn into a federal case, which would be fantastic also if she gets re-indicted. And then the recover, the provide support. Probably the most important part is the victims. That's why we're doing this. Too often, in the past, at least from law enforcement's perspective, we want to arrest the bad guys, put them in jail, and case over. We need to be more victim-centered, more focused on the victim and their well-being, and following up with the courts to check offender recidivism, ensuring mental health and support, and evaluating after success. One thing that we do here at TABC is we look at the calls for service at a location. It doesn't always play out in our favor. Sometimes the calls for service go up if the location becomes a BYOB bar. But a lot of times we will find that the calls for service will go down, and we've actually impacted the neighborhood in a positive way by shutting down a bad bar. So that's one way you can really evaluate your success. And then last but definitely not least, partner. As I said throughout every one of these steps, if you don't partner, I truly believe you're going to fail. Through this case, we partnered with DPS, the District Attorney's Office, Homeland Security, various NGOs. Internally, we've networked with our licensing division, et cetera. So all 5 of the P's are equally important. Without one, that wheel might not succeed. So that's the P's in a nutshell. Today, predominantly is over the protect part, but I wanted to give everybody a broad overview of how the wheel of success can work.
Thank you, Ron. That's perfect. We're going to move on. I'm going to shift the screen to Captain Eric Wilson from DPS. Before Eric gets started, I just want to remind all of our participants that if you have any questions throughout our webinar today, please feel free to put your questions in the Q&A box. We have Brittany Whittle from the Office of the Attorney General's office. She is monitoring that Q&A. And then, as you probably have realized, you will all be on mute and do not have the ability to kind of communicate verbally with this webinar. So if you have any things additionally that you would like to add, please feel free to put that in the chat box that you have on your screen as well. All right, Eric, I'm going to pass this off to you.
Thank you, Emily. Just picking up where Ron left off as far as on the collaboration side. I mean, DPS is a decent sized agency, and we don't have the resources to do these investigations by ourselves either. We're constantly partnering with outside agencies, federal agencies, local agencies to do these types of cases, NGOs, our victim services. There are a lot of similar aspects of criminal investigations for HT cases, but there's some of the working with all your outside agencies is definitely something that is just a must. One of the things that my background is working at a gang task force, violent crime task force. So the human trafficking world is a little newer to me. One of the things that is important is how regular standard criminal investigations can morph or change into a human trafficking investigation. We had that experience here in Dallas. I reached out to Kara when she was still at the U.S. Attorney's Office in Dallas and said, hey, we're just buying a small level amount of cocaine from a source. And our undercover did a great job of just kind of asking what we thought at the time, listening in on the wire was kind of a silly question. He said, hey, do you have any idea where we can get some girls? And the guy responded, this is a low-level drug dealer that we're buying an ounce or 2 of cocaine from, says, well, yeah, I mean, my mom can get you any amount of girls that you want. And so that spun up a case where we partnered with HSI. They provided wire monitors. DPS does not have contract monitors other than Spanish speakers. So they were able to bring in wire monitors that spoke Korean and other different languages. They provided manpower. They had experiences doing these types of cases. Dallas PD provided an Asian undercover that went direct with our target, got a lot of evidence that helped to procure a Title III. Dallas PD provided 50 undercover officers for our bust out operation, where our target delivered around 30 females for commercial sex purposes. Dallas PD provided the facility for processing. FBI flew in 8 or 9 linguists from all over the country to provide with assistance with translation. So it's hard to really overestimate the importance of collaboration. And then working directly with all those NGOs, advocates, our victim services to immediately get physical, psychological help to these victims. As far as co-location, that's something that is, for any task force approach, is a necessity. You see that be successful on any type of task force approach, whether it's a fugitive task force, drugs with your HIDAs, gang task forces with your tags, your Texas anti-gang centers. If you're working collaboratively with multiple agencies, it's very difficult to do that and not be co-located. If you're outside of that location, you're just kind of out of sight, out of mind. It's just natural for you to kind of get left out of those cases. We have human trafficking task forces all over the state. Houston's an example with the Human Trafficking Rescue Alliance. All the tips, all the Polaris tips come into the task force. Whether they need an HPD resource, Harris County, TABC, DPS, all that's under one roof, and makes for efficient investigations. I know we have a wide variety of people on the call. Even if you're from maybe a more rural area and you know it's difficult resource-wise to commit someone full-time, a task force is still an extremely important revenue avenue that you can participate in, because even if it's just part-time, if you're just contributing someone part-time and you have a investigation come up in your area, that's a force multiplier. You now have the entire task force at your disposal. And as far as investigative techniques, the same techniques that work in a gang, a violent crime, a homicide, those same techniques work in these type of cases. We did a Title III on the case I just referenced. We had PIN registers up, we had vehicle trackers deployed, physical surveillance, electronic surveillance, reviewing social media posts, both privately and getting records from those providers. So don't be intimidated if maybe you haven't done that before. You've done similar investigations. A lot of those same techniques are still applicable. When we get a call in for a victim, someone that needs rescuing, one of the most important parts of this is to have a standard operating procedure, have an SOP in place, so that when a call comes in, you get a NCMEC hit, you get a call, a Polaris tip, you get information from a confidential source, another agency, whatever the case may be, you have a standard operating procedure that is in place so that nothing is missed. We use checklist cards. I have laminated cards for, the best people in the world, whether you're doing a SWAT detail, dignitary protection, whatever the case may be, use checklists. And we do the same thing where we make sure that we have all those resources in place to locate, rescue that victim as quickly as possible. We're getting our victim services people on board at the very beginning, to where they know what's going on and they're the professionals in dealing with these victims. And again, this isn't something that I have done for 10 years, but I don't think I would ever reach the level of a professional victim services personnel as far as interacting with these victims in these cases. Things that we're getting lined up, you see on the screen, translators, certainly a common issue, lining up those victim services in advance, having a plan for medical, and then having a plan for your interview team. Something that's important, if our undercover officer has done an operation to rescue someone and has basically kind of, at the end of the day, lied to that person to then recover them, we don't want our undercover officer conducting that interview. We want to bring in someone else to conduct that interview. It is a different type of interview. You're not interacting with a homicide suspect, a robbery suspect. This is someone that could be in love with their trafficker, and that the person doing the interview has to take the time to develop the relationship with that victim and gain their trust. Again, just talking about the importance of coordinating with your victim services. Our standard operating procedure requires us to immediately contact our victim services to attempt to get a safe exam, and then to schedule a forensic interview at the appropriate time. A lot of times we'll do that in coordination with our victim services, so that things such as, making sure that the victim has time to get some rest, recover, things like that we have the availability at a CAC center to do a professional forensic interview, are all things to consider. As far as the interviews, We try to focus on them being considered more of a long-term approach. These are people that these victims have possibly been involved in this for weeks, months, or years. And so it's not something that on that initial interview, you might not have that outcry. You might not have everything that you're wanting to happen on the first time. We're trying to have that be viewed as a continual process instead of just that one interview.
All right, so I think it's turning over to me now. For those of you who I don't know, my name is Kara Pierce, and I'm the Texas Attorney General's section chief over the Human Trafficking Unit. And going along with what Eric just said, and our DABC partners and everyone who's going to speak after me, we are here to help. As Eric mentioned, he was a longtime gang investigator. I've worked with him for years, and he had a great team of guys that I also worked with for years who knew guns, gangs, and dope better than most people. However, when they ran into a human trafficking issue, Eric called me because he knew I knew about this. And so the AG's office is ready to answer those calls for law enforcement statewide. Our unit now has 7 experienced criminal prosecutors in it, and we created this HT Blue Line as a resource for law enforcement and prosecutors that come across human trafficking issues. It's a 24/7 line. We want people, if you encounter something in the field, day or night, and you have a question, if you need legal advice, if you might need search warrant help, or just questions about how to get victim services, we want to be here to help. Please write down this phone number and spread this around your law enforcement friends. It's 512-936-1938. The AG's office wanted to launch this in part to help further our strategic plan and help both the protect and prosecute side of the house be able to get their job done. So thank you very much. And next, we're going to highlight something that DPS has been actively doing for a very long time, which is their child interdiction program.
Emily, we're not hearing the sound on this.
Give me 1 second. I'm not sure.
Hello, I'm Captain Derek Prestridge with the Texas Department of Public Safety. It is my privilege to tell you about the Interdiction for the Protection of Children program, or IPC for short. IPC is a critical training program that helps police officers rescue children and save lives. In 2007, we recognized an opportunity to help law enforcement combat crimes against children, and we already have the resources needed, our patrol officers. We know that criminals commit horrific acts against children, including sexual assault, human trafficking, abuse, and many more. We also know that uniformed officers routinely make contact with suspects and victims who often travel our roadways. This proactive approach to policing leverages existing resources and personnel and can have immediate impact. The IPC program can be implemented in any law enforcement agency, from the largest department with thousands of officers to the more rural departments with only a few. Since its implementation, the IPC program has rescued hundreds of children in Texas, throughout the nation, and around the globe. These children might have otherwise been overlooked without the IPC program. Finally, I'd like to share a key message that we provide in every training, presentation, and briefing. Stop waiting for children to ask for your help. Stop waiting for children to tell you that they're victims of rape, abuse, or trafficking. To wait and expect a child to ask for your help places the burden on the child. Thank you for this opportunity to tell you about the Interdiction for the Protection of Children program.
This is something that DPS has had since 2009. You can see some of the stats on the presentation. It's, I mean, somewhat shocking to see, you know, just traffic stops by DPS troopers, 520 children rescued since 2009. They've done the IPC team has done a very good job of spreading the curriculum throughout the nation, holding a lot of train the trainer trainings to be able to reach as many agencies as possible. This is something that's also applicable, I mean, not just from a patrol standpoint, but from any other of your enforcement squads. A fugitive squad is an example of someone who's in houses every single day making those fugitive arrests. And this is something that the IPC team partnered with the U.S. Marshal Service. They taught the IPC program to these fugitive task force members. And I mean, it's been successful because they're in houses every day. I've been on a fugitive task force for 10 years. And until we had that training, that just wasn't something that was at the forethought of your mind. You make the entry, you make the arrest, you're trying to get to jail, and that's your job, is to basically get that one fugitive. This is part, including the IPC training to task forces such as this, is just another way of having that multidisciplinary approach. The DPS SOP mandates a victim-centered approach. The next slide will have that definition, and I'm not going to read it for you, but I mean, at the end of the day, everything that we're doing, we're interacting with that victim. We're taking into account their safety and well-being and making that be the top priority. In just common sense ways, that can be something as simple as asking them where they want to sit, giving them flexibility to schedule the day, time for interviews. When we're conducting those interviews, asking them frequently, do you need to take a break? Not overwhelming them with the number of investigators present in a room. Things like that are what we're striving to accomplish when we say victim-centered. As far as notifying the advocate, I mean, again, can't talk more about getting victim services involved. If possible, we want our victim services personnel being the ones to offer those services to these victims. And every case is different, but a lot of these people, they may have had interaction with the criminal justice system. They may have had negative interactions with law enforcement. If I'm offering that service, that may be something that's brushed off and is not accepted. If we have our professional victim services personnel offering those services, a lot of times they're more successful at getting them in to be able to provide those mental, medical, all those types of services to these victims. As far as a regional response, every situation is different. Obviously, Texas is a big state. There's clearly a lot different scenarios in bigger cities versus in rural areas. My perspective is this is something that's kind of more outside of law enforcement's expertise. The last thing law enforcement wants to do is to place a victim in with a local service provider who's maybe not properly licensed by the state. It's not properly equipped to provide those services. So that's something that we really depend on our victim services to help with getting those services immediately available to each victim. Again, when we're talking about actionable intelligence, that's part of our SOP, is providing, making it available, these sexual assault forensic exams, encouraging that to be the case. I traditionally think of a safe exam as something that's just kind of DNA, forensic, but there's a lot more to it. There's a lot more of a medical component, documenting injuries, getting that patient history. There's a lot more medical follow-up treatment that's there. And so that's certainly something that should be in any SOP is you know, having that safe exam be available and being able to get medical treatment as well as forensic evidence for prosecutions down the road. Some of these, we've talked about interviews, the importance of having forensic interviews, especially with children. We really rely on the CACs and people that are professional forensic interviewers that do that every single day. Our agents may do that occasionally, but having those people that are professional in their field, that's just something that we really, really rely on. As far as other resources for intelligence, there's all kind of people. I mean, your community is going to be different. You may get information from your school, from a SRO officer, from hospitals, from suspicious activity reports, from an iWatch program. There's all kinds of ways that you can get intelligence on human trafficking that's going on in your area. The iWatch program is something that DPS administers. I don't know if someone wants to write the number down in the chat. The 800 number is 844-643-2251. And it's iwatchtx.org. And there's also apps in the Google and Android stores. But if you're in a rural area where you're trying to gather intelligence, that's a resource that's available right now, that's up and running, that people that are seeing suspicious activity that they think may be linked to trafficking can report that activity to for follow-up. And it's like any other database. It's only as good as how much information is put into it. The more that's put in, the better that it will certainly be.
So as Eric's been talking, there's all these different forms of evidence, including forensic interviews, physical exams, sexual assault related exams, and all of that is gathered and the victim is put through that whole process so that we can develop evidence to prosecute his or her trafficker. And so it's important, and I love seeing how victim-centered these programs have become, because I don't know that historically it was always that way. But I think law enforcement is taking huge strides forward in being aware, in working with social services organizations and non-government organizations to have advocates there along the way to work with victims. I think that's super important. I think having trained sexual assault nurses who know how to handle traumatic people as they're doing their work, all of that is very, very helpful. And it all leads up to hopefully that survivor or victim making it through the process, and also us gathering that important evidence along the way. It's always a challenge, but it's a challenge that I think that law enforcement in Texas is up for, to make sure that you create a strong evidence case in a trafficking situation, while all the while being mindful of how that's impacting the victim and protecting the victim as much as you can. The goal in human trafficking prosecution is to have enough evidence that you are not relying on victim testimony. In some cases, that's really hard to do, but in other cases, there's ways you can do that. When you're putting a victim on the stand, you want him or her to be have extra corroboration or extra evidence, whether that's cell phone records, other witnesses who observed their victimization, social media accounts, hotel records, other things that help support what that victim's saying. So it's not a situation where it's a he said, she said. Law enforcement can do a lot through surveillance. It's always a lot easier to have a law enforcement officer get up on the stand and say, I saw the trafficker driving this car this day, and I saw the trafficker at this location these times. It's always easier for the law enforcement person who writes reports to testify about that than putting that on a victim. Data is huge. So much of, especially sex trafficking, has moved online. A lot of commercial sex activity has moved off of people walking on the street and moved to online. And with that comes a massive amount of data. But those commercial sex ads and social media posts and social media communications can be huge and very helpful evidence in trafficking cases, as well as interviews. Interviews can often make or break a trafficking case. And one thing to be aware of if you're a law enforcement officer embarking into trafficking cases, trafficking interviews are a little different. This is not a case where you're going to necessarily in an initial interview with a victim get the whole story. There may need to be subsequent interviews. That's why forensic interviews can also be helpful. Both forensic and law enforcement interviews sometimes are necessary, but understand that And just because a victim doesn't tell you the whole story the very first time you speak doesn't mean that they're withholding. That's another thing I always try to tell law enforcement who's used to interviewing primarily suspects, is that victims, especially when they're immediately recovered from trauma, sometimes take a while to become stabilized. Make sure that they have gotten their medical treatment, make sure that they're fed, that they're rested, that if they were on drugs, that they're off those drugs. And it takes a while sometimes for that to happen, but doing maybe an initial interview to get immediate information and then waiting for the victim to be stabilized is a victim-centered approach. And it's also an accepted and common practice in trafficking cases. So don't be afraid to put off the interview for a little while so that victim can be stable.
So to kind of piggyback on what Kara and Eric said, the training that is vitally important for law enforcement and all law enforcement agencies. In fact, we seek out training on human trafficking through various sources. DPS puts on some great training. The County Attorney and District Attorneys Association puts on some fantastic training also. And in fact, the video that will be shown here in a minute has a victim that we actually met at one of those trainings. So again, it goes to show how that networking is so vitally important. We'll go ahead and show the video, and then I'll speak a little bit about the video afterwards.
By human trafficking in Texas, do your part to help the victims who are being exploited in our state. This can help fight human trafficking in Texas. Do your part to help the victims who are being exploited in our state.
My name is Allison Franklin, and I am a human trafficking survivor. I cycled in and out of our criminal justice system. Making that connection that I was a victim of trafficking makes me angry, but it also gives me hope that we have an opportunity to stand up, that we all have to fight.
We've had a number of cases that maybe have started here in San Antonio and have ended up with victims in Amarillo.
$200 to say that pick her up at her house.
Having those long arms to reach out to different parts of the state is huge. Having agents all over the state being able to leverage those resources makes cases much more effective as an agent. At the end of the day, our goal is to rescue as many victims as possible and to combat as much human trafficking as we can within the state.
TABC has developed and organized a unit called Special Investigations Unit that specialty is in focusing on human trafficking, organized crime, cases that are occurring in licensed premise and alcohol beverage industry. Because we issue the permits to the licensed premise, we can go in and conduct inspections on a regular basis. And this gives us the opportunity to uncover signs of criminal activities, especially when it comes to trafficking.
This is a program that we've developed in order to build the capabilities and skill sets of our agents.
It's imperative that this training be at the leading edge of all training, the newest, latest innovations in technology, the newest, latest innovations in the training for our agents to ensure their safety, the safety of the public, and the safety of those potential people who could be victims of human trafficking.
I wish I didn't have a story to tell. I wish I had a different story to tell. But I hope that my story, inspires others to make sure this doesn't happen to someone else.
So Allison Franklin helped us put together a training course, a 3-week course specifically to target human trafficking and identifying victims specifically in licensed locations. And I think it's done fantastic. To date, since our Special Investigations Unit has been up and running since about 2013, but to be honest, when we started, we focused on a lot of different organized crime that was occurring in the alcoholic beverage industry. But we have been successful at shutting down over 100 licensed locations that were involved in felony type offenses. Not all of those were canceled for human trafficking because human trafficking is a very hard crime to prove. So sometimes we might shut it down might cancel the permit for the narcotics that were sold or for a subterfuge ownership, et cetera. But the efforts to disrupt that criminal activity has been very successful. Also, since if anybody noticed, I think Eric talked about the Human Trafficking Rescue Alliance in Houston. John Wall, who was a sergeant and was a lead player in that Houston PD task force, is now working for us and running that Special Investigations Unit. And the Special Investigations Unit has taken on a very specific focus on human trafficking, and they've been successful at identifying or rescuing approximately 150 victims since he's come over here about just over a year ago. So the training has been huge. Trauma-informed investigative techniques we'll talk about in the next slide. And these are, I know it's been talked about a little bit earlier, so I don't want to rehash it, but I don't know if there's much more important topic when you have a human trafficking victim. We find it, especially in the bars, a lot of these girls are prostituting themselves. And I say themselves in quotes. Are they doing it themselves or are they being forced to do it? And that's something that the investigator needs to look at. Are they selling drugs? Sure, we find that a lot in the bars, but are they selling the drugs to pay off a coyote fee? That's what we find a lot if they're undocumented immigrants that have come across and they incur this large debt to a trafficker. They can work that off in a bar. Do we have force, fraud, or coercion? Well, we need to investigate that. But if they're selling drugs and it's going to pay off their coyote fee, are we going to treat them like a drug dealer or are we going to treat them like a victim? I think we need to treat them like a victim. The empathy that we need to show and the understanding, also some of the girls, if they're domestic trafficking and they're underage, they're runaways, we need to look at the situation and treat them as victims. I think that's extremely important. Empowering victim self-determination. They're making a choice, and as Kara said, I have yet to see one come forward on the first time we go into a bar and, lights on, music off, and we start talking to the girls that are in there. I have yet to see one girl say, I'm a victim. I have seen on follow-ups when we do a follow-up with a victim services coordinator or an NGO where they start to talk, and some of them don't even realize they're victims. So we need to create that safe environment during the interactions. We need to separate them from the male customers that are in there. That might be their pimp. It might be the bottom girl that is in there. You just never really know, and you can't take enough precautions. And the main thing I think is that we don't jump to what cops do a lot, jump to that we're going to arrest all the bad guys. You sold dope, you're going to jail. We need to look at why they were selling the dope and were they doing it under force, fraud, or coercion? And if so, they're victims, they're not suspects, and we need to start treating them as such. So, turn it over.
Jimmy, do you want to talk about this slide?
Oh, yes, ma'am. Sorry, I was waiting for you. Good afternoon, everybody. This is Jimmy Lindsay with the Texas Parks and Wildlife. Today, I just kind of wanted to give the audience some insight on Texas Parks and Wildlife and how we're going about combating human trafficking. And we're doing that in two ways. One is through our training, and the other is our collaborative efforts with other LE agencies. First off, our training. A lot of our training is done at our Game Warden Training Center, which we've hosted the Interdiction for Protection of Children course this past year and coordinate also with DPS on future courses. We're working to get 100% completion rate for those game wardens and park peace officers in the field today. Our training center is also mandating that the IPC course as part of the field training program for all of our new officers. So everyone that's coming out of our academy today is having this IPC course completed. Along with the IPC course, our game wardens, also park police officers, are taking both the TCOL human trafficking and advanced human trafficking courses, along with the IPC courses. Not only the training, but also giving our wardens and park officers those resources, those different contacts. So if they do come across some type of either human trafficking or IPC case, they know who to reach out to get that extra information for some of the questions or assistance needed. Because as game wardens, park officers, we don't deal with human trafficking on a regular basis. So being able to give them that information on being able to reach out to fellow LE partners to help them with any questions they may have. And another part of combating the human trafficking and prevention is through collaborative efforts with other LE agencies. That's a big part of it. For instance, in October of last year, we had game wardens and park police officers participating in the Crimes Against Children patrol operation. This operation was part of the DPS-led interdiction, excuse me, for the protection of children program, with multiple LE agencies participating throughout the states. During this operational period, game wardens and park officers conducted their routine patrols while being hyper-vigilant, as well as documenting and reporting any suspected activity. So this is just one of the ways, and some of these different operations that go on. Also, for instance, this month we have the Human Trafficking Awareness Month. So all of our game wardens and park officers are out there staying vigilant and aware of, possibly, any human trafficking activity there is. So really for us, and not necessarily for us, for every, LE agency out there, a lot of it just is having that training for your officers out there and those out in the field, and also providing them those resources for answering questions they may not have or be able to answer. And then also just, talking with your partner agencies, assisting them with any operations they may be having going on at the time. And then also just working close with their community. We have game wardens that are in these small town communities. They know who lives there. They know who's there. So just being aware of, noticing something that's out of the ordinary, and just, being proactive and asking those questions and helping us stop this human trafficking.
Perfect. And I'm going to give this off to Kara to highlight some of the training that we do have available for law enforcement.
So as if we're talking about, collaboration is key, working together is key. And as part of that, we would love for law enforcement to participate in one or more of these trainings we have coming up. On February 25th, we're going to start with a human trafficking investigations course. That course would be appropriate for pretty much anyone working in law enforcement, whether they're the boots on the ground, whether they're rolling around a patrol car, whether they're a CID unit, or as Eric mentioned, fugitive guys. That one's appropriate for everybody. The March 25th one, we're focusing more in on agents and investigators, where we'll be talking about, all right, we've gotten the initial report of trafficking, and what are we going to do with it, and how are we going to have a successful investigation? And then the April 22nd one, we're going to be addressing interviewing witnesses, both victims and potential traffickers, as well as leading up to and being able to set up a successful prosecution. Sorry, accidentally unmuted. In addition, as we're talking about prosecution, which obviously that's another webinar and another day, but I can't help myself. There are some unique things to know about trafficking cases, and there are tools that can be used to protect victims. Texas law is moving towards being more victim-centered. One of the unique things available are protective orders that are available for all victims of human trafficking. And those protective orders can be sought by the victims themselves, by parents or guardians of the victims, or by prosecuting attorneys. And in lots of instances, we don't seek those protective orders till after a case is complete, so that the victim would then have to testify in that hearing. And those protective orders will protect them from potentially lifetime future contact with their traffickers. They'll prohibit traffickers from coming within a certain distance or contacting victims. And in some instances, that can be extended out for the remainder of the trafficker's life. In addition, one of the core things that we do is we don't use victims' real names, and we have mechanisms by which we can use pseudonyms to protect victims' identities.
Perfect. Thank you, Kara. And I'm going to hand it off now to Sophia, who will be able to speak for the Human Trafficking Survivor Leaders Council and be able to provide a survivor perspective.
Thank you so much, Emily. We are ecstatic to be a part of this whole process. And we were able to actually provide a kind of detailed overview of making sure that the survivor perspective and lens was in the planning that would be rolled out for the state. And so in any time that we do anything, we always want to make it clear that the views, opinions, and thoughts and statements that we represent is just us as a council. It doesn't represent any company that we might be associated with. And so on here, you can kind of see the list of our Survivor Leader Council members. And I act as the coordinating leader of that group, which we are actually primarily designated through the Texas Association Against Sexual Assault. And we work very closely with the governor's office as well to eliminate child sex trafficking. And so as we move forward, our mission is to review, recommend, and develop survivor-informed policies and best practices that address commercial sexual exploitation and human trafficking across the state. Our ultimate vision is to really see cultural change and sustainable practices that enhance efforts to end commercial sexual exploitation and human trafficking. With that being said, some of the overriding themes that we saw in this particular section was to really dive into proactively addressing disparities in policing prostitution and focus on the demand of the strategies. And what that really proactively means is to say, a lot of time we see that there's more harsher penalties for those that are arrested and prosecuted and convicted for prostitution, as opposed to the exploiter or as opposed to the buyer. And so this whole construct that without demand, there's no need for supply. And so if we're more demand focused on those that are perpetrating the demand for the need for trafficking, especially in adults, then we can really have a full circle strategy on it. Also making sure that we incorporate the trauma-informed response. And you've heard several of the guests prior to me talking about really being strategic in implementing trauma-informed response. It's one thing to just say, you know, we want to go ahead and convict individuals that are perpetrating this heinous cycle. But when you don't have victims that can actually self-identify, when you have it to where you're kind of one lens focused. So let's say, again, you have a survivor that might have committed a crime on behalf of their trafficker or as a means of just survival, and you're not looking at, you know, why this was done, or for familiar trafficking, which I'm a survivor of as a juvenile, where I had a parent that was trafficking me. When you're not looking beyond kind of the stereotypical pimp on a corner and things of that nature, and really understanding how we can be re-traumatized over and over again going through the prosecution process, it really hinders us as opposed to helping us. And so really incorporating that trauma-informed response and being able to know that it's a long-term strategy, even beyond the prosecution and the conviction. You have to realize that for us, it's a lifelong journey. And then again, really using a term as opposed to rescuing someone, to recovering. Sometimes, again, people don't feel like they need to be rescued. It's almost as if they're indebted and now obligated to whomever comes in to help them in their situation. But being able to recover someone, again, that might have been lost even on an emotional wavelength. We heard about individuals talking about those that might have gotten caught up in this industry as a runaway. We know that you're 2 times more likely to be approached within the first 48 hours of being a runaway as a juvenile when it comes to that. If you're in foster care system, you're more vulnerable. And again, they don't necessarily feel like they want you to rescue them. They want to be assisted in getting out. And we also know when it comes to those that are in the life, they may not feel empowered or have a sense of wanting to completely break free, because there might be a fear factor that's involved in that right away. So you might be dealing with someone that literally 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 times it takes them to completely break away and truly to recover themselves and their own identity. So that was just one perspective that we wanted to go ahead and kind of make a suggestion about. It's just even how you're talking through the terminology when it comes to survivors. So in essence, in this particular realm, making sure that we're equally looking at the criminality factor when it comes to adults, when it comes to prostitution, and also comes to buyers, which we know do not have the same amount of disciplinary action against them. A lot of times don't even get arrested or prosecuted, unfortunately, especially if you don't have all of the cooperation from someone that is being arrested for prostitution charges. However, being able to look beyond the actual act or crime and looking at what is the circumstance that this is being done in is very important. We heard that talked about. Also making sure that law enforcement, along with their partners and community stakeholders, are having that trauma-informed lens to truly understand and kind of dive deep into our minds as survivors. And then lastly, making sure that you realize that you're not being harmful in trying to help. And that, again, everybody is not ready when you feel that they should be ready to be recovered or to get out, especially if there's a fear factor involved, or if they feel obligated, or if they have a child by a trafficker. There's so many different facets, and that's why having that trauma-informed lens can be so important to helping us, and also being able to ultimately end sexual exploitation. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Sophia. That was perfect. All right, Ron, I'm going to toss it back to you, give an overall kind of summary, and then we'll jump over to Q&A if we have any lingering questions.
Absolutely. So I think it's really good. Everybody kind of echoed what the others said, and that's what we're supposed to do as the coordinating council, is provide a singular voice and focus on these things. And the action plan for Protect, collaborate to identify and rescue victims. I think I like the word collaborate, but even more personal is build relationships. They should be able to pick up the phone and know you by your first name. I know when Refugee Services of Texas called about the case down in McAllen, it literally was a, "Hey Ron, how's it going? Are you interested in this case? We have some victims that we think are willing to work with law enforcement." It wasn't a, who do I know over at TABC? They already knew me, and that opened that door, and that made that working relationship so much better. So collaborate, but also build relationships. Victim-centered interdiction, we talked a lot about victim-centered, although these victims have possibly committed crimes, they might be runaways, we need to focus on them as victims, and we need to take that to heart. Not prosecute them when at all possible. Sometimes I know you got the street cops out there on the street, and sometimes maybe it is in their best interest. You got a 16-year-old girl that's a runaway. You're looking for any reason to get her off the street. That I understand. And as a parent, I would want you to do that. But I think it's something that you need to talk to your DA about and say, "Hey, this girl was uncooperative. We don't want to prosecute her for whatever it was she was doing. We just need to get her help." That's the key there, is getting them help, not prosecuting them. So it's counterintuitive to a lot of cops, but it's a paradigm shift that we need to overcome. And then human trafficking for law enforcement, we can train and train, and we should train again. Everything is evolving. We debriefed a permittee who we knew had been involved in human trafficking in the past, and we were actually talking to him, and he kind of laughed at us and said, we don't keep these girls locked up anymore. That's not how trafficking's done. It's done through, we get them an apartment and we just scare the heck out of them. We tell them we know where your family's at. It's not so much force anymore. It's a lot of fraud and coercion. I'm not saying there isn't force. I'm not saying some of these aren't being held against their own will, but predominantly what we're seeing is they're being put up in an apartment, and they're being told, they're being scared. They're already scared of law enforcement, whether they're runaways or undocumented. And they're being told, look, you don't go anywhere without coming to me. and they pay the rent, they go to get all the essentials for them, and they never leave that house until it's time to go to work, which is where they're trafficked. So with that, ensuring protective measures are used. I know Kara and everybody talked about that. Pseudonyms, emergency protection orders, similar to family violence cases, shelters, housing, getting money, SANE exams, psychological support, victimology on these victims, trying to figure out exactly how did they get there. And I think that will help us solve the problem. And that's my summary. If anybody has any questions, or Emily, Eric, anybody else wants to chime in, thank you very much.
Thank you, Ron. I think we have a couple of questions that Brittany Whittle is going to post them out. I think we got some for the speakers. In the meantime, if you are an attendee, please, we would love to hear from you, just to get an evaluation of whether you thought this was helpful, if you'd like to see future trainings. And just a reminder, check the chat box. We have some, if you have any questions for more information or anything like that, just let us know. But Brittany, I'm going to send it to you. I think we have one question, at least in the queue.
Yes, the question that we have is about how we are talking and what the preferred terms we're using. So rescue versus recover, also I think victim versus survivor. And so maybe we could get Sophia to talk a little bit about what's preferred in that community. And then I don't know if any of our law enforcement wants to speak about kind of what they're using and why.
Perfect. Sophia, can we toss it to you first?
And just so I'm clear, because I was reading chat messages while you're talking, you want to get some suggestions on the terminology?
Yes, I think the question was in here. Let's see. Oh, are there any other suggestions for preferred terminology, such as recover versus rescue?
Oh, well, again, the rescue portion and why it's so important that we talk about this is, as a survivor, you already feel you're indebted to someone, if that makes sense. So you already feel like, you're in a situation where, Swinson just talked about it. Ron just talked about the fact that there's always a fear factor and a threat involved. And so recover, or again, we even just say to assist, or, we try to lighten up the fact that now somebody's going to feel indebted to you. And you almost kind of have to deal with that hero complex that they talk about. They now feel like they have to work off of a debt to you because you rescued them from something. Or is it really a rescue if they don't realize that they're being trafficked? And so that's why it's just poignant. You'll know case by case and who you're dealing with, why that terminology, just being careful with that. Because again, and I'll just give the example, my mother was my trafficker. And so I did not realize I was being trafficked at the time. I'm 13, 14 years old. I just feel like I have a mother that is neglectful. And even when I originally went to law enforcement and said, my mother has a lot of men around the house, she has me interacting with them all, like it went over their head originally. But I couldn't say I'm being trafficked because I didn't have that clear understanding. I just knew we had to have food, we needed to eat, my mother had a problem, and I was trying to address it. So it's just really to be mindful when you're dealing with someone that doesn't even realize that they're being victimized in this context. So again, even if you're just assisting them to help find, another resource, or you're helping to recover them from a situation, as opposed to always feeling like you have to come in and save them. And also you want to empower them to let them know that it's ultimately really their decision to leave a situation. So is it really a rescue if we're empowering them to feel like I can get out of this, I'll be safe, you will help me? It's really about how are we helping them to have the power to leave.
Great, perfect, thank you. I know we are running short on time. If there are any other panelists who want to speak to that question, or that might be it for the extent of our questions that we have, but let's see. Just a reminder, I want to kind of put this out as everyone is wrapping up. I know we all have additional schedules, but Today's discussion was just part of the strategic plan. So today was about protect, but if you want to learn more about providing support services, I know the governor's office replied to our chat, but we will, they're working on children advocacy centers and working with them and coordinating their responses. So that'll be another portion of the webinar series that I just want to direct you to some of our dates. If you want to find us on social media, here are our handles for Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. And then if you are looking for more information, or if you want to get on our mailing list, please email us at humantrafficking@oag.texas.gov. And then, as I said, just a reminder to join us each Tuesday for our other webinars. So next Tuesday, we obviously have Prosecute. The following Tuesday, we will have Provide Support, where we'll talk about providing follow-up care for victims after recovery. And then finally, we'll finish on February 16th with Partner. To register, please just send your name, title, organization, and email to humantrafficking@oag.texas.gov. And then, yeah, hopefully we see you next week. We can use the rest of this time if there's any other comments or information that the panelists want to address for the questions. But as I have all of you here, first, I just want to thank you all for our panelists for their very insightful and informative feedback. You guys were tremendous today. Thank you so much. And thank you all to our attendees. The Coordinating Council wants to thank you for your time and your effort in fighting tirelessly against this crime. So thank you for your attention today, and we hope to see you next Tuesday. Thank you so much.